when it's all is said and done, the prop is there for a reason. I love trees, like absolutely love them. I check out trees like guys check out a Labongini or a Rihanna video. Trees have been in my life right since I was a kid. They were like personal buddies who would never disappoint. There was one tree where we stayed off Gong Road. It's a huge tree that termites liked a lot. Me and my little brother would spend a lot of time up there. And when my mom asked us where we used to be, we'd say we'd be upstairs. Trees was where we lived. We hung out. We wanted to be like that white monkey man called Tarzan. We aspired to be around trees. I spent a lot of time in shags every school holidays because my parents had this consistent habit of always taking us shags every holiday. And shags is where there was all manner of trees. Our favorite trees tended to be fruit trees, mostly guava, and there was one tree called jamna. I think it's a special plum. And I still get nostalgic when I see jamna in any fruit market. And we spent so much time just hanging around these big guys. There are big guys, there are small guys, there are all manner of trees. And the one thing my grandparents and my parents always did is they're always planting trees. They called it pedoyen, which in Jango, Luo, translates to growing trees, but what it actually means is nurturing a tree, as one would say, nurture a child. And so it's of this idyllic environment that I started finding my first manhood lessons. And my first impressions of how to be a guy came from the guys I was hanging around. The most influential one of them all was my grandfather, Samuel Nyadwe Angawa. And he was a church elder and a sort of like a community organizer. And from him, I learned the vital lesson of everybody is family. I came from a city background where my family was my immediate siblings and my first cousins. But in Samuel's house, everybody was family. We were related to everybody. From my dad, I learned the value of responsibility. Because my dad had this thing about every time we'd go for supper every evening, about 50 meters from our house to my grandmother's house. It's about 50 meters in the pitch dark. And he would say, "Where's your weapon, soldier?" Because he always believed that as a man, I had to have a weapon so that I could protect myself and protect those around me. Another thing that he spoke against a lot was laziness. He hated lazy guys. Every time he found me hanging around doing nothing of substance the whole day, he would come up in his typical booming voice and he'd say, "The whole day, you better. Give me to a malongo, be onge. Do you want to become a professor of nothingnology?" Then there was my brothers. My two older brothers, there was John, who was an amateur boxer, and there was Charlie, who was a taekwondo, shotokan. He did all sorts of stuff. And from them, I learned the value of self-defense. In our house, you walked around with your guard up because you could get thooped. And they told me that when you leave mommy and daddy's house, the big wide world is rough. So learn how to defend yourself, learn how to protect yourself. So off with these lessons, I was taking the big bright world, joined the University of Nairobi as a student in Bachelor of Anthropology, and I started a life for myself. Naturally, when I got into campus, the first thing I asked is, where is the sport of men? And I was directed to the rugby pitch, where I found a band of brothers. And for the next 4 years, we became teammates and soulmates. But along this time, I was in my early 20s then, at a time when the pursuit of happiness was all about getting some action. And I looked at this new world that I was sort of thrown into. And it was amazing that as a guy, something that was really important was to be a gentleman, or rather to be a romantic, and to be financially successful. Like, if you're romantic and you're financially successful, women took you really seriously. I mean, if you were out on a date and you knew how to pour the wine and you dressed correctly and you said the right words and you had good taste in music, and you could order something exotic like souffle, s'il vous plaît, and the women would just, it was amazing. You'd be taken quite seriously. Now, I found it a bit confusing given my background, and I was confused because I just gotten a gig as a critic, a relationship columnist, and my qualifications, I had no psychology degree, I had no professional training. All I had was as a guy, and I'd been a guy for the last 20-something years, and I was being told to write about my experience. So I started writing stories about what I saw, what I felt, what my colleagues were going through. And in 3 short years, I had sort of picked up a reputation as a sanctioned chauvinist, a female basher, and among the men, a voice for men. So life was changing fast. And people were saying all these sorts of things about what I was, and I was wondering, who are these guys talking about? And I remember recently I read a quote from Barack Obama, and he says something about the first time he got into office, I think the first 4 years when he got into office, and he was facing a lot of criticism and a lot of hate coming his way. And he says, when people talk about that guy called Barack Obama, the thing you have to remember, that's not you. That's not you who you were. And I started saying, that guy they were calling Oyunga, that's not me. Because there was a whole different side to me that I try to keep hidden because my marketing-oriented friend said, it's not good for the brand to be spotted shopping for sweet potatoes in Kangemi at 9. Nobody needs to know. But what a lot of people didn't know was that I love to cook because my mother had told us by the time we were by age 9 that there's no boy or girl in this house. Everybody must cook and clean. I learned detail and refinement, things like spices, how to smell at the feet of my older sister. So I cooked first for selfish reasons because girls in campus were amazed that a man could put edible food together. Then I started cooking because I'd been living alone for so many years and I had to eat healthy. And eventually I learned just the joy of cooking. I was also a terrible mess when watching sentimental movies. Action movies did nothing for me. But a good story, a good drama, and the climax when the underdog finally triumphs and they cue the music, I would just be crying. And I'll be a mess. I mean, I would embarrass my buddies, you know. Guys just didn't get it. Not good for the brand at all. So life goes on. I keep on writing. 7 years in, I hit a career high as the founding editor of Kenya's first men's lifestyle magazine, a magazine called Adam, that was called Men First. But the irony is that I've gotten to this supposedly the peak of my career, and I'm not feeling contented. I'm feeling really boxed. Surprisingly, I have become that man that I've been trying so hard to run away from. I'd become the stereotype, I'd become the poster child, I'd become that Jama. I was the actual guy. And it was as though I lived in a parallel universe. One universe, I was this guy who wrote and represented men, and this other universe, I was just me. Regular self, somewhat shy, a guy who was just trying to make the best of himself, grow, learn more. And my change would come in a very sort of like odd way, because for guys, change is dramatic. Things don't just happen. So I'm riding a motorcycle on a loose Tuesday, nothing dramatic happening on that day, about 11 o'clock, and this guy hits me from behind with a hillock struck, and I'm flung off the bike, fall off the tarmac, and the guy hits me again. By some miracles happen, I survived. I survived. And on that day, 19th October 2010, I decided I have to be the man that I have to be. I have to be the man that I want to be. So I took a break from writing. I retreated. I went back to that place called Shags, among those trees that I grew up along. And from there, I started picking up myself again, finding my personal awareness and finding my balance. Because trees, believe it or not, have been some of my greatest teachers. And From trees, I learned a very simple and straightforward lesson that in order to grow outwardly, manifest outside, you had to grow inside. Because even if you look at the mightiest of the trees, a mugumo tree, for a tree to grow upwards, it sinks deep. I had the privilege of managing a forest, inheriting a forest that was bequeathed to me by my father, planted largely by my grandfather. And I started sitting in canopies of trees that had been grown almost 30, 40 years before my time. And the thing that amazed me about all these trees is the trees in a forest, especially when you've watched them grow over time, is the trees, I think, innately know they're interdependent. They're always interconnected. Because a tree knows that if it helps the fellow tree, it's helping an ecosystem. And in helping each other, everything thrives. I came to realize that the man that I had actually become, the man that I was as a result of many, many, many invisible hands that had basically helped me up. All I was a little sprout in a huge social network of roots. Because if you stand and look at a forest, it's all happening underneath. We don't see it up here because we tend to think the growth of a tree is in the crown. But where a tree really grows is under the ground. And under the ground, various species make room for each other. So all I was a sprout, a little small outcrop in a huge network. And I came to realize that ultimately a tree is not a forest, and we need each other. We are codependent. So when it's all said and done, what has been my lesson? What has been my lesson in the journey of life? And I found out ultimately, in order to be who I am, in order to be the guy that I need to be, in order to find my sense of purpose in this life, I had to be like a tree. I had to always remain grounded, no matter how high my head was in clouds of success. I had to be always connected to my roots, for it is my roots that gave me back. I had to always be in a position to turn over a new leaf and let go of the parts of me that had basically died. I had to be able to yield and to bend and to allow the storms of my life to pass and get back into formation. I had to accept the inevitable seasons that came that we had no control over. But most importantly, I had to continue growing and I had to continue giving.